His name was Thomas, and he lived in London, in the modest flat inside Leighton's area. He couldn't even tolerate the idea of living with a roommate, so he juggled two jobs to afford a place for his own. Leaving London was out of the question for Thomas. He saw the city as vibrant cultural epicenter, brimming with activities he could partake. The irony was, he preferred to stay at home, immersed in video games, avoiding social interactions altogether. Yet, he couldn't even bear the thought of leaving London. Thomas was a stout 30-year-old man. During the days, he was working as a barista in the coffee shop, and during the nights, he worked as a security guard at the construction site. His social circle was small, limited to Carolis and Jacob. Carolis was tall, lean, the soul of the party kind of man, stark contrast to Thomas's quiet and reserved nature. If the Thomas would slip out of the party with more than 3 people, nobody would even notice his absence. But Jacob, on another hand, was a stern-looking man, with similarly stern-looking wife, and 3 small children, under 5. The men met rarely due to their hectic schedules, but once they did, they spent most of their time at the pub, drinking beer and discussing life. This was perhaps the only social activity Thomas truly enjoyed, feeling it was more than enough interactions given the daily exchanges with colleagues and customers at work. As evening descended, Thomas hurriedly packed his dinner and dashed off to work. The 50th bus was running late again. Shifting restlessly from foot to foot, Thomas looked at his watch, contemplating. The station isn't far away. Maybe I should walk. But what if the bus arrives while I'm on my way to the tube station? I'll just wait. After 15 minutes, the bus finally arrived. Climbing aboard, he found no available seats, and standing was scant. The delay had clearly aggravated the usual crowding. Annoyed, he scanned his Oyster card and looked at his shoes, unnerved by the throng of people around him. Automated voice finally announced Leighton Station over the bus speaker. Thomas, alongside the other passengers, disembarked and headed towards the station. Headed over the center, the tube was half empty. The bus passengers had dispersed into different carriages, leaving plenty of space for Thomas, and he felt much more at ease. After 10 minutes, the train stopped at Liverpool Street Station. He, and along with a considerable amount of travelers who had boarded the train at Stratford Station, got off the train. Reaching the construction site of a new skyscraper at Bishopsgate and showing his ID, Thomas entered the site. In his security booth, he sat down at a worn-out chair, boiled a kettle of water, made himself a cup of hot tea, and calmly watched the camera monitors as the construction workers left for home. The night was quiet. Apart from having to work overnight and once an hour patrol the site, and the dark shadows in the corners stirring thoughts of monsters and demons, Thomas liked this job. He didn't have to interact with anyone, and he could watch movies, play video games, or read books on his laptop. In the 6 months he had been working here, nothing happened that caused any concern. No break-ins, nothing was stolen. Of course, during the day, workers would steal tools from each other or a bit of building materials. But at night, it was peaceful. Outside the high fence perimeter, the sound of police or people moving about could occasionally be heard, but Thomas didn't care. His philosophy was simple. If it didn't happen inside the site, it wasn't his problem. Around 3 in the morning, Thomas started to feel drowsy. Barely keeping his eyes open, he drank an entire can of energy drink just in a few gulps. He got up from the old but comfortable chair, took a powerful flashlight, put on his jacket, because despite it being May, the nights were still cold, and went to patrol the area, hoping that it would help him to stay awake. He was right, by the way. The night was cold. Walking briskly through the construction site, he looked around, but everything was quiet and peaceful. Today the construction workers had excavated a new pit, massive parking garage that would be under the skyscraper. He descended the swaying scaffoldings, thinking there was nothing special, although the pit was already as 5 stories building deep. Thomas himself didn't know what drew him, but he decided to walk to the middle of the pit, and at that moment his thoughts were only on the next day, when his long-awaited vacation would start, allowing him to stay at home without any disturbances for 2 weeks. Strange. In the middle of the pit, he felt emanating heat from the ground. Strange, Thomas thought. There shouldn't be any gas pipes this deep, but I better not smoke. Putting out his cigarette, he decided to head back to his post, where the next episode of his favorite series awaited him. Carefully climbing back the scaffolding, Thomas once again breathed in the refreshing coolness of the night air. But that was definitely a natural warmth down there, he thought once more. Not even halfway back to his booth, he felt the ground trembling. The trembling caused him to topple over onto the ground, and as he lay there, holding his head, he hoped that nothing would fall on him. Thomas had forgotten to bring the helmet with him, because nothing ever happened to him bad before. The ground started to tremble even more violently, and he could hear the scaffolding collapsing. How fortunate! I have already climbed out of the pit, he reassured himself. Closing his eyes and holding his breath, he waited for intensifying tremors to cease, but inside, he felt that they would never stop. Suddenly from the pit, a tremendous roar was heard, as if 100 lions merged into one enormous, furious monster roaring angrily at the world. Thomas squinted. Afraid to turn around as heat enveloped his body, man felt like he was burning, as if he were standing on the sun, and everything around him was bathed in red and yellow light. Terrified, Thomas rolled onto his back and saw that from the hole where he just had been, a huge flame was shooting upwards, reaching the roof of the 30-story buildings. Thomas couldn't breathe, not only out of fear, but also because each breath was painful, due to the hot air entering his lungs. Suddenly, the flames disappeared. The trembling resumed, and from the pit emerged a hand, as large as 25 meters long buzz with 4 fingers, long, black, sharp claws, barely shorter than Thomas himself. The ground began to split. Thomas quickly jumped off the pavement and started running, feeling the earth slipping behind his feet, and then knowing that there was no time to turn around. The city of London is empty at this time, as most of the pubs are closed and the offices have ceased working long time ago, except for people like Thomas and some cleaners tidying up, but most of the population was already at home asleep. The roaring was heard again, and when the earth stopped shaking and Thomas perhaps ran 300 meters away from the construction site, he stopped, turned around to look. Around there were ruins, houses tilted to the sides like old rotten trees after a strong storm. The street had collapsed into a pit, which was almost 100 meters into diameter. Thomas heard a strange rustling, like fabric, maybe the wings of a large bird, only the sound was so intense that it sounded like a thunderstorm roaring next to his ear. And then he looked up and saw a gigantic bird. No, not a bird, Thomas thought. It's a dragon. As long as 2 big bends stacked on top of each other, its shoulders as wide as Boeing 747-8 wings, a head like a huge mountain, and wide shining horns, sharp claws, as long as Thomas himself. Thomas already knew that the whole London must have seen this event. A significant part of the city was destroyed, a gigantic monster roaming the skies, whose roar was probably heard not only in London but in surrounding boroughs. The man wanted to be anywhere but here, even from the great distance. He felt that his and the dragon's gaze met. They stared at each other. The dragon's eyes, green as emerald, seemed to be right beside Thomas, perhaps even inside his soul. Thomas felt a sense of relief because of the dragon was smiling inside of him. He understood that nothing would happen to him, that he was safe, that the dragon was smiling. One more time, dragon released long, hot stream of fire into the sky, flapped his wings hard and fast as a jet fighter left the London scenery. It all lasted maybe 10 minutes. Although it seemed like hours for Thomas, the city was awakened. Police, fire brigades, and the ambulances' sirens were heard. People's screams and prayers, "For this is the end of the world," resounded loudly, because for them it seemed like the devil escaped from hell. Helicopters flew in the sky with their spotlights on. News service vans arrived, trying to report this news as fast as they could. Videos filmed by people quickly spread on social media, and citywide panic began. A few moments later, the military appeared around the pit. Thomas decided it was time to go home because it was too scary to think what they would question him about. Would they trust him? Was he to blame for the chaos in the city and the dragon's gaze that he felt inside of him? All these questions raised fear inside of Thomas. Therefore, quietly, trying not to be seen amongst the chaos in the city, he headed home, towards the same way that the dragon had flown. The walk home took over a little 2 hours, and Thomas thought he made it, but there were already 2 constables waiting for him at his door. Turning around and quickly walking away was out of the option because one of the officers saw him and shouted him by his name. "Thomas Turner, please stop, as I don't want to chase you." And although very scared, Thomas stopped. The constables approached him and one of them asked him if he's alright and uninjured. Thomas just nodded, indicating that he's alright, but the officer saw the fear in his eyes. "Thomas, we would like you to come with us to the precinct and answer a couple of questions, if that's alright." Thomas just nodded again and followed the officers, get into their car, and was glad they did not put their handcuffs on him. The journey to the station was silent. Neither Thomas nor the constable spoke anything. In Thomas' mind, all terrible thoughts were swirling about what awaited him. How many questions will he have to answer? But he himself knew nothing. He decided that he would not lie. He would answer everything as he saw it. But he felt inside that he should leave the part about the dragon to himself, because he doesn't think the constables would like to hear that he felt the dragon inside of him. The car stopped. The officers got out first and opened the doors for Thomas. Only now did the man felt his legs trembling, and he didn't want to go anywhere, wishing that this car ride would have never ended. But now he would have to talk with strangers who would question him like the biggest criminal who destroyed half of the London. The men walked through the doors of the precinct, and they were immediately greeted not by the police officers, but by the soldiers with automatic weapons, whose Thomas only seen in video game. "Mr. Turner, thank you for coming." He was greeted by a pleasant but firm voice, whose owner was the Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Sir David Bradley. He was tall, with a sporty build, light blonde hair, and strikingly blue eyes. Thomas had seen him on television, and his presence commanded attention. Dressed in the ornate regalia of his rank, his dark mottled service jacket sharply contrasted with his white shirt, each wrinkle and crease meticulously ironed, on his broad shoulders adorned with gleaming insignia marking his highest rank in the British Armed Forces. The weight of his responsibilities were clearly evident. Medals and awards hung on his chest, each testifying of a lifetime of dedication and service to the king and his country. He held a peaked cap under his left arm, perfectly positioned, its shiny badge catching the light. The men gave each other a strong handshake. The grip was firm and quite painful. Thomas always believed that to make a good, strong impression, one needed a firm handshake. David made a huge impression on Thomas. At one point, Thomas couldn't bring himself to look at Admiral's eyes due to the fear of the man's strength, but at the same time, he couldn't avert his gaze because he was so fascinated by what he saw before him. "Please, follow me, dear Thomas." This shouldn't take long. The Chief of Defense Staff continued to speak in a pleasant tone. Thomas followed him without hesitation. Both men entered a small room that had a table, 3 chairs, and a recording device. One chair was already occupied by a stern-looking woman, and Thomas recognized her. He had completely forgotten that Jacob's wife worked for the police. Seeing her now, he thought how foolish he was to run home. He instead should have run to Carol's or Jacob's home. They would have helped him. As if understanding his thought, the Admiral said, "We've been expecting you at yours and your friends' homes." Thomas snapped back to reality. It's obvious that the government would know about his friends. He had seen enough films to know that they had spies everywhere. "So, Mr. Turner, first of all, tell us why you ran from the scene and how did you survive the dragon's attack?" Thomas slowly signed and said that he ran because he was afraid everyone would blame him for the attack, that no one would believe that some creature appeared out of nowhere and left him alive. The recording device swirled slowly, capturing every word. Jacob's wife sat quietly, listening, and the Chief of Defense Staff listened to everything Thomas had said, with a stern but understanding demeanor, without interrupting. As planned, Thomas left out that he had felt the dragon inside of him, and that the dragon's gaze pierced his soul. "Are you hiding anything else, Mr. Turner?" Admiral Radley asked sharply, keeping his eyes fixed on Thomas. Thomas quickly shook his head, not wanting the Admiral to hear his trembling voice. The Admiral narrowed his eyes, piercing Thomas. Suddenly, both Admiral Sir David Radley and Jacob's wife recoiled from Thomas as they saw how quickly the man's eyes changed. They became emerald green with slitted pupils, cold and reptilian. Thomas slowly shifted his head sideways and grinned widely. "Now you will answer my questions, Chief of Defense Staff Admiral Sir David Radley." Thomas said it in a cold, almost hissing voice, while simultaneously growling. "Don't move!" He snarled as he saw the Admiral's assistant about to run. She froze in place, cold sweat running on her face. "Ask," said the Admiral in a firm but cautious voice, his face showing no trace of fear, now with cold eyes looking straight into Thomas's green eyes. "You know who I am, don't you?" said Thomas. "Yes, I do," replied Sir Radley. "You are Grimfear. We have awaited your return for many centuries, preparing for your comeback." "And what do you plan to do now that I have returned?" laughed Grimfear. "You would have stopped my return, prevented such a deep constructions. Now you just make the fools out of yourselves." "In part, yes. These days solicitors are quite cunning. We tried every way to hold the constructions, but over the 700 years, the history and legends of you have remained in only few of our minds. And others, they don't need to know that the dragons existed." "So, you're one of the Knights of the Order of the Garter?" The Admiral nodded. If nobody remembers that our noble race existed, it means my brothers and sisters are no more. Yes, you are the last. After your imprisonment, it took us 20 years to hunt down and eliminate all of your kind, said Sir Radley with satisfaction. Only you, the greatest and the strongest of all, remained unkillable. But when we caught and imprisoned you, your brothers and sisters fell like the autumn leaves, one after another. Thomas' eyes returned to their usual brown color. The Admiral sat calmly, smiling, as if chatting with the dragon was another conversation with his grandmother over tea. Throughout the conversation, Thomas, the real Thomas, though unable to control himself or move, he heard everything that was happening around him and to him. Jacob's wife, Irina, sat with widened eyes, a mix of horror and shock. All of this was way too much for her to comprehend. "Who are you?" she asked. The question mattered to Thomas too. Who was the chief of defense staff? Who was the order of the Garter? Why he had to become involved in all of this? And what the devil was going on? As two soldiers entered the room, Thomas quietly glanced over their uniforms and noticed the pinned to them was a badge with a symbol indicating allegiance to the royal family. Before he could think any further, black opaque fabric bags were placed over his and Irina's heads. He felt himself being pushed down on the ground rather roughly, his hands restrained. He could hear Irina's cries and pleas to be released. After a few seconds of struggle, Thomas was pulled back to his feet and still held, as he could tell at least by one of the soldiers. In the darkness, Admiral Radley's voice rang out quietly. "I apologize for this, but you cannot know where you're going. And I'm sorry, Irina, you cannot be released until the situation is resolved." After these words, Thomas felt himself being led down the corridor. After several hours of travel with a bag over his head that had started to stink, Thomas had heard the car doors open and felt someone helping him to exit. After a few minutes of being led, all movement ceased and footsteps were no longer audible. The bag was removed from his head and his eyes stunk from the light. Apparently it had already become dusk. As Thomas adjusted to the light, he saw an old gray-haired man standing before him. It took him a few seconds to realize that he was standing in front of the King of England. Thomas almost choked seeing the king, but he steadied himself and, not knowing the protocol what to do, he just bowed his head out of the panic. The room where Thomas was quite small. It had one small table, one small chair. On the table was writing materials, and there was huge painting on the wall with what seemed was all the members of the order. "Sit, please," said the king. "I assume you have a lot of questions, and I shall try to answer them all." The order was created around 1300s, when the Dragon War began. In millennia or so, dragon population became tenfold bigger, and they became very aggressive, starting to pillage and burn our cities. And their purpose in the world became to conquer us, because they consider themselves way more superior than us. And, well, maybe they were more superior than us, because they understood, they lived peacefully, they were wise, they understood the cosmos, the universe, while we were burning heretics and witches. Ironically, when we figure out what witches and heretics were, we killed way too many of you. Yes, you, dear Thomas. You are the conduit to the dragon. Dragon spirit can possess your body and speak to you, through you, to us. Many famous astrologers and scientists were conduits. More precisely, dragons spoke through them, letting us know and having the knowledge about the cosmos and the world. Unfortunately, at that time, we considered dragons as soulless beings, no smarter than a dog. Oh, how we were wrong. But it was already too late. Our brutality made dragons angry. They started to retaliate, burning our cities. Thus, we started to hunting them down, and the war began, lasting over 300 years, until the greatest and wisest of them all, Grimfir, launched the biggest attack and burned down the London. Yes, by your expression I can see that you understand that in 1666 the Great Fire of London was not an accident. It was a large scale attack on our settlements. After that, it took us 3 years to hunt down Grimfir. But he was too big, too strong, too powerful, too wise for us to kill him. Somehow, we managed to imprison him, but never kill. So, for nearly 300 years he lay beneath the city of London, guarded, imprisoned, until last night, when he escaped. Therefore, Mr. Turner, you will stay here until we find Grimfir. Because through your eyes he can see, and through his eyes you can see him. You will be the one who help us to kill him this time. Do you understand? We won't keep you in cruel conditions. We have a prepared large room for you, with food and other amenities. However, there is no windows, and you will not be able to walk freely through the corridors, so that you do not expose our hidden location. When the king stopped speaking, the soldiers placed a bag over Thomas's head, led him down long, winding corridors. In the room, they removed the bag from his head, and Thomas realized, despite what King said, he was the prisoner.